I'm Frank Hutchison.
I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And welcome to the Hidden History of Business podcast.
Well, today we'd like to go back in time to the year 2000, or rather, what people thought the year 2000 was going to be in 1900.
Back in October, the Washington Post published an article about a series of images and postcards that were, in theory, made for the World Fair in Paris in 1900. They were made to depict what this artist thought the world would be like in the year 2000. Now, it turns out that those cards weren't actually released in wide release, at least, until much later. A set of postcards was actually discovered in the 1980s by science fiction god Isaac Asimov. He found these postcards and he ended up publishing them in a book called Future Days, which if you'd like to read, you can hunt that down on Amazon for the low price of $276.05. But it's really interesting. He took these cards and he gave commentary on each one of them, which is kind of a follow-up for him because back in the 60s, he'd written his own article about what the World Fair would be like in 2014. You can head over to our website and actually read that. It's pretty funny and scarily kind of accurate. But Emily, you were going to go over and explain a few more of these historical cards to us.
Well, these images they're just absolutely fascinating. First of all, it's very obvious the time that they were drawn in. They very much stick with the fashions of the time, the artistic style of the time.
Now, what's the range on when they were created?
What we've been able to find from our research is 1899 up to 1910.
Okay.
There's a little bit of contradictory information that we found on them, so I believe this was actually several different sets that were made at different times.
So we're dealing with late Victorian, Edwardian kind of transition.
And the cards that we found were created by French artists, and I'm not going to try to pronounce them. Meredith is our...
Jean-Marc Coté.
There you go. But he was one among several who created these pictures.
About 87 of them, is that correct?
I've seen 50, I've seen 87 as the numbers being thrown around. We haven't found that many images themselves, but we will be linking to them on our website, so you can go take a look at these pictures.
At www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.
So we have in these pictures everything from a maid cleaning the house with some kind of mechanized robot. Looks like a prototype of a motorhome to someone running an entire orchestra by themselves as a live performance of a play is going on. The entire orchestra is filled with mechanized instruments. There are flying machines that are really rather odd to look at. Some that are similar to the airships, the zeppelins, the dirigibles that were just some of the newer inventions of the time, and some that look like very, very strange helicopter-ish kind of things.
It's kind of like a hot air balloon with a propeller on top instead of a balloon.
Biplanes crossed with bat wings. Anyways, go look at these pictures. They are really, really fascinating. But as we were looking at them, we found some interesting themes that we think are very telling, both as windows into the time that they were created, as well as into what needs people were trying to fill, what problems they were trying to solve. So we have pictures about home and daily life. We have pictures of transportation. We have pictures about warfare. We have pictures about communication and crisis response. There's one I think is just fascinating with flying firefighters that Meredith will get to talk about a little bit later.
And then there's our whole off-the-edge category of strange underwater amusements.
Yes, this particular artist, for some reason, was really fascinated with the under-the-sea theme. There are divers riding gigantic seahorses. There's one where they're playing croquet under the water. There's a race in the Pacific, it's titled, where they look like they're riding these eel-ish creatures.
Sturgeons, maybe?
Maybe sturgeons?
Yeah.
Something like that. Fishing for seagulls from under the water.
There's a whale bus, an entire bus attached to the bottom of a whale being transported through the water.
So, yeah, under the sea was a definite new frontier for people to explore. So, anyway, those were some of the themes that we discovered, and we'll take a look more in depth at those as we go along, as these themes of problems people were trying to solve.
So I'm going to start off by talking about some of the crisis response and transportation images we saw. Two of the ones that we found really fascinating. There's one where you see an image of an urban scene, and there's this taller, almost apartment building, and a woman standing on a balcony. There's a fire, there are flames behind them, and there are these firefighters. They look almost like the flying monkeys from The Wizard of Oz. They have these wings attached to them. They have these little helmets and caps. What's that detail there, Em? Can you see it?
Oh, I just see there's a mother on the balcony of this burning building, holding out her baby to the firefighter to take and rescue.
And they're carrying these hoses, so they're spraying onto the fire. You can see that there's a steam engine of some kind coming towards them, but it's a very dramatic scene. Now, when you think about the 1800s, I mean, fire has always been a great fear in any urban area, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. All throughout the world, there's never been an urban area that has not been tormented by fire. But that became an even greater threat during the Industrial Revolution and into the 1800s. It really hit its climax because you had so many people moving into the cities, so there was great urban growth, more people living more densely, and you also had a higher degree of industrial machinery that could actually spark these fires.
And building materials were almost entirely flammable.
Completely flammable. And in many cases, you had these historic buildings made of thatch and wood and mud right next to these stone buildings, but they were very close, so it was very easy for fire to hop. And just as a short survey, you have the Paris arson in 1871, the Great Paris Opera House fire in 1887, where more than 200 people died. The same year, there was another fire in an English opera house that took nearly 200 people. There was the Great Brooklyn Fire in the 1870s. Here in Spokane, there was a huge fire in 1889.
It wiped out most of downtown Spokane.
Almost completely. The Great Boston Fire was in the 1870s. The Great Chicago Fire was just the year before that. The San Francisco Fire happened during the time period these cars were being created, 1906, which was actually, it occurred after an earthquake, but fire was the secondary crisis that came with that. In Hokkaido, Japan, in 1907, there was actually a fire that wiped out nearly 80% of the city, leaving more than 60,000 people homeless. 2 years later, there was a fire in Mexico in a theater. 1910, there was a massive fire in Philadelphia, the Friedlander leather scrap fire, where many police officers and firefighters lost their lives.
And links to information about these fires will be on our website.
Yep, we'll have an interactive map there that you can go and explore, so you can get some more details on all of these. But the real point is, there is an overwhelming frenzy about fires. It's something that people couldn't control, and in most cases, fires had to be fought from the ground level. You had to bring in the water and try to fight it from the ground floor, and if you've ever dealt with any kind of fire, it's very hard to put it out on the bottom level when the top is still burning. That's just not going to work. People are going to die, lives are going to be lost. So this idea that you could actually attack a fire from above was incredibly fascinating to people. And we've seen that. We do that now. Washington State just burned this last summer. I mean, we saw it. And one of the most critical firefighting tools we had were helicopters dropping water.
And the air tankers.
And our air tankers, yes.
Dropping the fire retardant.
Exactly. That's one of the ways that we know. They knew back then that would help fight the fires, but they didn't know how to do it yet. And this is the closest they were able to get. The second crisis response we found really fascinating was rescuing sailors at sea. There's an image of a flying machine. It looks kind of like the Wright brothers' plane, and it's coming into a ship that's obviously sinking to rescue these sailors. Now, being lost at sea was one of the great fears, because you probably wouldn't know that it happened. All you would know is that a ship hadn't shown up. In some cases, they might know that there'd been a storm or someone had kind of seen the ship. But it was very common for you to send off a sailor and lose them at sea. In fact, one of our ancestors was lost at sea, and his wife didn't find out for years because you just didn't know. So the idea that there was actually a way of rescuing these people in a completely uncontrollable situation, it hit a very primal need for people who felt very out of control, who were dealing with massive catastrophes. And we see that in these fantasies. They aren't just silly technology ideas. They're really getting at this primal fear that people had.
I took a look at the pictures that involved warfare because what you have here are people looking at how we would use these new inventions to do something which we've been doing for literally eons. And you have flying machines being used, you have dirigibles being used, and they're up there and they're shooting down at people. Then you also have a vehicle being used as what would be later called an armored car. You have the driver and you have a machine gun that's on top, and he's going along firing.
It looks in the picture like he's plowing into a tank or something similar.
Car.
Yeah, another car maybe.
Another battle cars.
Well, and you think about it, a lot of images, especially if you go to Edgar Rice Burroughs' writings, he talks about land ships that are able to cruise and have battles. He was using image of the sea to describe land battles using vehicles. What did ships do in the past? They rammed each other. So here you have the vehicle ramming another one. Of course, it has firing guns and everything else. You look at all this, and what you see is images which would not become reality for another 10 to 15 years.
But they did. I mean, a lot of them are, they may have been adapted, but they're pretty similar to what we see now.
Yes.
Well, there's one here that it describes as a torpedo plane. As they're flying along, one of the people in the plane is firing down.
Which they did have torpedoes at this time period.
Yes, they did. In fact, if you remember from the Civil War, Admiral Farragut says, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Well, those torpedoes were really mine. But later on, what they did is they took those mines, put a motor on them, and that became the modern torpedo.
So this idea that you could drop one of those from above a battle was a big deal.
Oh, it was. These were really revolutionary ideas at the time.
And one of the other images here is of an aerial battle where they have a Zeppelin, a dirigible, participating in a battle over the ocean. So there's ships on the ocean, there's airships in the air firing on each other, and the little French flag flying right there.
Yes. So you had all that, years ahead of its time. And what was really fascinating for me is that when they first introduced flying machines in combat in World War I, they were just used as basically horses. You used to have the cavalry, they'd go out and they'd do the reconnaissance, and they'd come back and report. Instead, you had airplanes going up, seeing what was out there, taking photographs, and the pilots used to wave at each other from the opposite sides. And then they started saying, well, wait a minute, I'm going to take a pistol up there, I'm going to shoot the other guy. And that wasn't very effective, and so they tried rifles, and that wasn't much more effective. And they tried holding machine guns. That didn't work, and was finally only when they said, hey, we put the machine gun on the plane, fix it so it shoots straight ahead, and we aimed the plane, that it really became an effective fighting machine.
So you're talking about World War I, but that wasn't the first time that aerial recon was used in the military. It actually goes back to the 1700s.
Oh, yes, but they were using tethered balloons for those. But again, it was a case of, in the past, what you do is you'd find the highest hill and get up on there and you'd look out using the Mark I eyeball, or later you'd have a telescope and you'd see what was happening, and then you'd send runners down or use flags to signal the information to your troops. What the tethered balloon did was just give you a high mountain to be on top of no matter where you were, because you just raise the balloon up however high you want it and you can see.
But you couldn't direct the direction of your air balloon.
No, because you were tethered to the ground, and whichever way the wind was blowing, that would be where you'd be, and that's how high you go, and so on. But again, it turned out to be tremendously effective, especially during the American Civil War. The Union particularly used it, and it was very effective in giving them insight into what the enemy was doing and what the lines were.
I have here some notes that the first balloon corps was actually created in France in 1794, and it was used there in the battles of Charleroi, and that they maintained active until the Egyptian campaign, and that during the Civil War, there were hot air balloons as large, some of them could hold 32,000 cubic feet of air.
Hot air.
And could hold 5 people, and they would station them around D.C. and Manassas. They were used extensively in the Peninsula Campaign and during Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, to the point that when they put them up, they could see 7 miles away.
And that was important, especially like when you think of Chancellorsville. That was an area that was heavily forested. So your cavalry wasn't very effective, and being able to see 7 miles is a phenomenal advantage.
So the invention of these Zeppelins, these dirigibles, was a major step forward, in large part because you could steer them.
Yes.
You could make them go in a certain direction. And these cards are really representing cutting edge technology for the 1900s. The first Zeppelin was developed in detail in 1893. It was patented in Germany in 1895 and in the U.S. in 1899. And then these cards came out in 1899 and 1900. This is cutting-edge technology. The Wright brothers didn't have their first flight until 1903, the end of the year.
Yeah, December.
This is the equivalent of using drones now.
Yeah.
In fact, we see something kind of like that in one of these cards, don't we?
Oh, we do see a postal carrier delivering mail by plane. It's not really a plane. It kind of looks like a glider with a seat on it. He's handing the mail to a man on a balcony.
Yes.
Okay, now I find it really interesting that, I mean, there are a lot of these cards that focus on underwater transportation, on underwater games and amusements, but there's none of them that focus on underwater military action, which is confusing to me because this is around the same time that the submarine was being developed and purchased by the U.S. military for the first time. So why all the focus on the air and not the water?
Well, first of all, underwater warfare was considered ungentlemanly.
Really?
Now, why
in fact,
is that?
it was international law required that if you're going to attack someone, a civilian ship especially, a warship was fair game no matter where it was. But civilian ships, you had to stop, you had to board the ship, you had to search them to see what they were carrying, you had to give the passengers a chance to get off into lifeboats, then you could sink it.
Oh.
So submarines weren't really very practical for that because of the rules. So most people looked at submarines for really two purposes. One was coastal defense. Okay, you have it go outside the harbor and it's going to torpedo warships before they can shoot guns at you. The other one was the submarines would go out there and they'd be the scouts. They'd be there, they'd be able to see what was happening, they'd be able to radio back, and then if there was dealing with warships, they could torpedo them.
And the enemy would never know.
And they wouldn't know that they were there. Whereas with other types of ships, if you can see the enemy can see you. So submarine was great as a scout, and that's what people thought. It wasn't until World War I, when Germany is getting desperate for a way of winning and forcing England out of the war, that they go to unrestricted warfare, where, hey, if you go into a certain area, doesn't matter who you are, we're going to torpedo you without warning.
So before that, the idea of using a submarine to attack someone would have been the equivalent of shooting someone in the back.
Yes.
Okay, that makes more sense.
It was not something that gentlemen did.
And of course, we're in the Victorian era, so gentlemen.
Yes.
Yes.
Whereas, if you think about the air machines, the air was considered sort of like this cavalry. You know, instead of horses, you're on airplanes or dirigible or whatnot. But there's certain rules that gentlemen follow and do that. In fact, you take a look at a lot of the language and the stories that come out of World War I about the fighter pilots. They talk about them as being like gladiators or knight, the Red Baron. You know, yes, they were out there killing each other, but they were doing it as gentlemen.
Now, there's also this huge category of pictures about domestic life and housework and farm work, and even there's one machine where they're putting eggs in and little baby chicks are popping out. Emily, you really looked at those pictures a lot. Can you talk some more about those?
Yes, I find these absolutely fascinating because some of them are so accurate or forward-thinking. They, like, for example, the one I mentioned at the beginning, the maid who is working with this contraption that's cleaning the floors for her. It's definitely a step up in that she is not on her hands and knees on the floor scrubbing with the brush herself. But she is still controlling the machine that is doing all of the work. Whereas today, for example, we have the Roomba. I don't know if you guys have seen the adorable YouTube videos of the little cat that's stuck on the Roomba as it's
Or the chicken.
the chicken. I love the chicken.
You would watch
one.
cat videos.
Oh, you
would.
know it. But so there's this idea of taking life as it is now and making it, incrementally better. Instead of being on my hands and knees scrubbing the floor, I will now be standing up and I will be controlling this contraption that is doing the scrubbing for me. But there's also other really interesting, very forward-thinking pictures. There's one that kind of reminded me of the Jetsons, of this dinner party sitting around this table, and their plates, they have these tiny little plates that have what look like little pills on them. It's a chemical dinner. So in 1900, the idea of advancement, food-wise, was these little pills that you ate, which to me doesn't sound that appealing, but for someone who spent hours and hours and hours preparing meals and all of the work and the effort that went into creating meals in the 1900s, early 1900s, without all of our modern conveniences, that may very well have been very much worth looking forward to. One of my favorites is called the Correspondence Cinema, that looks a lot like Skype or FaceTime.
What does the picture look like?
You have a gentleman sitting at a table in a chair, kind of lounging back, speaking into a cone. What is that? A microphone of some sort, staring at a screen that has a projected image of a woman on it. It looks to me like he's speaking to this woman in real time.
And what that represents really is For example, that cone is what you had for the phonograph to record voices, which was already being done by Edison. And so they take what they know and they are translating it to what they would like to be able to do.
Exactly.
Yep, they were using phonographs or like the wax cylinders they would record their voices onto.
Well, and again, this is a time of great technological innovation. This is when the telegraph and the radio are all coming into being. Yes. Absolutely, right around this time period. So this is really cutting edge and then taking it one further step. Another picture that I really liked was a gentleman and a lady lounging in their parlor, and it's entitled Hearing of the Newspaper, and you have a phonograph that's playing the news for them. Well, that certainly sounds like the radio. It sounds like audiobooks.
Like podcasting right now.
Absolutely, what we're doing right here. But perhaps my favorite picture of all of these is a lovely scene. Again, it looks like in a parlor with several gentlemen and several ladies sitting in chairs having a lovely conversation in this beautifully decorated front room around a fireplace, and it is entitled Heating with Radium. Now, for those of you not familiar with radium, it is atomic number 88, and every single one of its isotopes is highly radioactive. Half-life is approximately 1,600 years. Radium is not healthy. It was discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898. So again, this is cutting-edge technology.
And that discovery did what to her?
She didn't fare so well.
No, she didn't. She died of serious cancers and radiation burns.
Radiation poisoning, absolutely. But again, the dangers weren't known in 1898 or 1899 when these...
Just the wonders. Because one of the things that you do with radium is you can combine it with other chemicals and you have glow-in-the-dark.
But also,
compounds.
we just talked about this, the extreme danger of urban fires.
So they thought they'd found this solution.
And we say this all the time, today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. You think you're solving a problem, and you are, but you don't always understand the consequences. And luckily, we did not go with radium heat.
Mostly because it was too expensive. You had enough to be able to heat things up.
That's fascinating.
Now, it certainly solved the problem, like you said, of the danger of fire and the coal burning, very dirty. Radium, in contrast, would be a very clean burn. But certainly, our current perspective is not always sufficient to understand the consequences of our actions in the future.
Well, we've seen that in our own family. Our mother was a DES baby. DES was a medicine that was given to women who had trouble carrying pregnancies to term through about the 30s through the 60s. And they discovered that it actually caused birth defects in people who had it at higher doses. No one meant to do that. They just didn't realize it would have those consequences. It can actually have consequences to the second, third, and fourth generation, they're finding. But people were trying to save their babies. They were trying to save their lives.
And same thing with thalidomide was used to decrease nausea in women who were incredibly sick during their pregnancies. It was this wonder drug that allowed women to not be nauseous and vomiting their entire pregnancies. It also, unfortunately, had some horrible, horrible side effects and birth defects. But again, it was attempting to solve a problem and unintentionally creating additional problems in the future.
And we can sit here and say how funny some of these ideas were, how obviously dangerous they are, but it really goes back to this idea that they were trying to solve problems. Like with housework, Emily, you did some research into how many hours people were actually spending on housework.
The research that we did, it was really interesting because it shows that back in 1900, 1912, around the time period that these drawings, these cards were made, housewives spent upwards of 56 hours a week on household tasks. And that included supervising children and cooking and cleaning and all of that stuff. And it was also an average number. There would have been some who spent more and some who spent considerably less, especially considering whether they had servants, how large their household was, how many children they had, whatnot. But 56 hours. And then in the 1960s, it had only dropped to about 44, which kind of surprised me that there was that little change, really, in those 60 years. Today, the latest numbers I've seen are that women spend about 18 hours a week on household tasks. And some of that is due to greater technological advances that allow us to do more work in less time.
We really changed our lifestyle. We're not doing as dirty work most of the time now. We aren't burning coal constantly. We don't have that same burden for cleaning necessarily.
Though we do have generally a higher standard of cleanliness now.
We do.
Yes.
But I think what we really see there is that they wanted to solve the problem that daily work had these repetitive, labor-intensive daily tasks, whether it was getting a shave or getting dressed or cleaning or having to supervise many maids, even just wanting to simplify that down to one who didn't have to work as hard or be as injured, that people wanted to find easier ways to make their daily life better. And those are some of the innovations we've really seen. I mean, that has happened. We are down to 18 hours. We do have those solutions just in a slightly different format than they originally thought it was.
And if you take a look at the pictures that involve the farm life, that's also interesting because, for example, where you put the eggs in one side of the machine and out comes the baby chicks on the other, incubators.
Yep.
You know, it used to be, back in the 1900s, you had chickens and they sat on the eggs and that's how you got baby chicks. Not anymore. We industrialized that process. The chickens lay the eggs go into incubators, they hatch, and we get baby chicks by the millions.
Though there are definitely some who would argue that that's not progress.
There are, yes.
That might be, but
for the farmer at the time whose life was dependent and, I mean, could very easily lose their farm, lose their livelihood if they weren't able to create faster, better ways of doing things to be competitive, that was a huge issue. There was another picture, right, of a farmer controlling his field?
Yes. And if you think about tractors with GPS, then they basically control where the tractor is going.
But Emma, can you describe that picture?
Well, you have an elderly gentleman perhaps sitting at a control board with some levers and some buttons, watching as machinery cuts his, is that hay? Cuts his wheat down
some kind of crop.
him. Some kind of crop down for him. Several different machines in the back, stacking the hay up into piles, all of this stuff that before would have been very labor intensive, certainly not the job of one person.
Well, you would have people out there doing that. They would gather up the hay. They may have a baler, and you might have a machine that's going out there and cutting, but it was still very labor intensive.
I think it's really interesting also that it's an elderly farmer. Even reading in my, we have copies of my grandfather's letters that he wrote to my grandma during the 1930s when he was helping his parents on their dry farm in southern Idaho. And the great fear was mom and dad were getting old and they wouldn't be able to do the work anymore. It was too hard. It was too backbreaking and labor intensive. What are we going to do if dad gets too old? And this whole fantasy that you could sit there and just push a button and have these things happen is a huge deal. Again, we're getting back to that primal fear of how are we going to survive? How are we going to make more money and be more stable?
And you also see it, in fact, the number of people in the United States that are involved in farming. It used to be that almost everybody was a farmer. Today, like 1% of the population is involved in agriculture, and that is all aspects of agriculture. And they produce enough food for all of us, plus food to export.
One other really interesting picture is the vision of school in the year 2000. So you have this classroom. It has a couple of maps and posters on the wall, and then a bookshelf on the one wall on the right side. And right next to the bookshelf, there's what I'm assuming is supposed to be a teacher, a professor, standing in front of a machine, putting books into the top of this machine as one of the students cranks a crank. And these wires go from the machine up across the ceiling and then drop down to these headphones that all of the other students are wearing. So you put the books in this machine, you turn the crank, and the information automatically goes into the ears of all of these little students sitting at the desks in the room.
It looks almost like he's feeding the books into a wood chipper.
Yeah. And of course that seems absolutely outlandish, but then again, we have audiobooks. We have inventions that allow us to communicate information that's only been in printed form to people who need it in a spoken form.
My kids have iPads in their classrooms now.
We have a Khan Academy.
Absolutely.
You know, you can learn almost anything.
E-learning everywhere. Yeah.
And especially the younger generation nowadays, they always have earbuds in. They're always listening to something. Often it's music, maybe not necessarily educational material here, but that's certainly a very interesting innovation that they saw coming.
It's also interesting when you consider that at this time most schoolhouses were mixed grades. So you're also looking at a teacher who wanted to make their life simpler. Instead of having to teach different lectures over and over again, you see this fellow who's just sitting there, and there are different lines there going to these people. You can almost imagine that they're able to send different lectures to different children. And it's a very
individualized education.
It's a very fascinating approach, again, to making these very labor-intensive, time-intensive tasks simpler. It's kind of sci-fi, which is, I mean, you don't really see how those books are going to turn into sound.
But this time period is the birth of science fiction.
It's true.
It really is. H.G. Wells, who is this amazing classic sci-fi author, was publishing Time Machine in 1895, The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, which is just creepy, disturbing if you have ever read that. I mean, vivisection and ugh.
Read the book, not the Marlon Brando, Val Kilmer movie. Skip that. Read the book.
Definitely. The Invisible Man in 1897, and the classic, The War of the Worlds in 1898. This is the time that science fiction was born. I mean, it's not just H.G. Wells, of course. There was Edgar Rice Burroughs and several other authors that were capitalizing on this intersection of the Industrial Revolution and all of this technological advancement and moving it forward.
And that's a really important point to make, I think, because a lot of the articles we found that discuss the series of postcards with predictions talk about how strange it is that they don't mention outer space or some of the other things that have obviously become the focus of our exploration. But it's also important to get that context because outer space was a huge part of what people were interested in exploring. These cards are just a few artists' perspectives. They aren't necessarily representative of the entire swath of people in the early 1900s.
And if you'll remember, in one of our earlier episodes, I talked about the book called History in the Making, that took a single event in history and then tracked how that event was described in history textbooks as it went along. And often the perspective was very different, even within 5 or 10 years of another retelling. So our perspective is constantly changing. We're constantly learning new things. Our limited ideas and paradigms of how life can be, how it is all connected, change.
But we do have this ongoing theme. People do keep imagining. And Frank, you had some really interesting examples from the space program.
Well, in the late 60s, you had the engineers at NASA realizing that they were developing a lot of technologies that had applications far beyond the space program. And so what they were doing in order to come up with things to invent was they were going through all these comic book stores and trying to find classic Flash Gordon and other science fiction comic books, looking for ideas of what they could develop. And if you think to the late 60s also was Star Trek. You had communicators. Flip it out and beam me up, Scotty. And what did the first cell phones look like?
Well, not quite the first ones. The first ones were these big
blocks.
chunky blocks.
They were like walkie-talkies.
Yes.
But the first that you could put in your pocket were just patterned after those communicators. You had the tricorder, and you had those hospital beds that, take them down to sick bay, put them in the bed, and they had these machines that tell you everything about them.
Tablet computers, we saw those on Star Trek early on.
So you had a lot of those. But what's really interesting is because in my library, I have a collection of books that I found because when I was growing up, I read a lot of science fiction, and one of my favorite stories was the Tom Swift Jr. series. Now, he was flying off into space. He was going underwater. What I discovered was that there was a Tom Swift series. Now, this was started to be published in 1910. Every book was about one invention. For example, the very first one is Tom Swift and his motor car. And there's Tom Swift and his motorboat, Tom Swift and his airship, Tom Swift and his electric locomotive.
And there's another big one I never would have connected to Tom Swift. You were the one who was telling me about it. You said that the taser actually came from Tom Swift.
Well, that's the idea. The Tom Swift and his electric rifle. He develops this rifle which has an unlimited capacity to shoot. He ends up going to Africa, and he's in an airship flying along, and he's shooting everything in sight.
Not the most PC story.
No, this series is definitely not PC according to our standards today.
But that's where the name Taser came from.
Yes.
Taser, Tom A. Swift.
Electric rifle. Yes, the story, yes. But for the age, these were the wondrous inventions. Building a new electric locomotive was high tech. Building a motorboat that could go faster than anyone else was high tech.
Yes, we saw a resurgence of that in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s with the new wave of science fiction masters.
Yes.
Which brings us right back to Isaac Asimov,
who was one of the masters. I mean, he wrote over 500 books. Everything from science documentaries to science fiction. Of course, his Foundation series is one of the classics of all time. So you have all those. But what's still amazing is that they're looking at the future and playing the what-if games. In fact, Arthur C. Clarke once mentioned that sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. And that's how people really described a lot of this stuff. It was magic.
The whole point is people had fears and needs and problems they needed to have solved. And one of the ways they did that was through imagining and through myth and through science fiction stories. Well, thanks everyone for joining us on that exploration of the past. If you'd like to learn more, you can hit up our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. We'll have links to all of these postcards so you can review them, some other interesting articles. And if you have any questions, please head over to our Facebook page. You can look for the Hidden History of Business. Go ahead and like us there. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz.